Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 16 wide receiver rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into Week 16. After which, I'll transition into talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual wide receiver, while also presenting statistics in order to justify these overall rankings. Before we get into today's video, for those of you looking for a specific wide receiver, there are timestamps down in the description. While you're down there, if you appreciate the content, the timestamps, all of that, be sure to, of course, click the like button and subscribe if you haven't yet already. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the season with the singular goal of capturing a 2023 fantasy football championship. And as you can hear from my voice, I'm not at 100%, but we got to continue to grind because this is all about capturing a championship. So tomorrow, of course, we'll be back with tight end and quarterback rankings, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday live stream. So be sure to swing on or by if you have any questions in regards to the upcoming matchups. Thank you very much. All right, so let's talk about matchups at the wide receiver position. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we've gone ahead and isolated wide receiver receiving statistics allowed from weeks 5 through 15 in order to identify, based on receiving statistics in terms of receptions, receiving yards, and of course, receiving touchdowns in a half PPR scoring format, which matchups are the most advantageous going into the given week. The Philadelphia Eagles, Washington Commanders, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they have been at the top of this conversation for as long as I can remember. Of course, we want to take advantage of these matchups considering how many touchdowns and how much yards they give up, considering their secondaries have either dealt with a lot of injuries or, of course, they just can't cover teams. That's certainly a point in which we want to go ahead and take advantage. So that's why I present these statistics. Now, when we transition into talking about some of the more difficult matchups, it's not impossible to be able to put up a great performance against the Jets and or perhaps the New Orleans Saints defense, even though they're the best in terms of this overall category. We just saw Jaylen Waddle for a second time this season go for over 100 receiving yards. So if the wide receiver and the quarterback play is talented enough, they can get the job done. Just wanted to go ahead and present these statistics. I'll refer back to these numbers over the course of today's video when I see it applicable. Now that we've covered this, let's transition into talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings. And a reminder, rankings are subject to change. So I'm going to be naming players over the course of today's episode like a Michael Pittman Jr., Jayden Reed, Keenan Allen, Nico Collins, but I have no clue whether or not they're going to play. By the time we get to Saturday morning's live stream, in which I have rankings on screen, all that kind of jazz, we'll have an idea or a better indication. So again, for those of you who are trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings, you can either swing on by this weekend for the weekend live streams, or you can go ahead, travel down below, head on over to Underdog Fantasy and sign up today using code Andrew. Making that first-time deposit minimum of $10 not only is going to get you that first-time deposit match, but it's going to get you my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. And because there's a Saturday game this upcoming weekend, of course, I'll also be sending those rankings by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, flex rankings included, all-encompassing rankings. For those of you wondering if you could take advantage of the opportunity of helping me help you, check out the map to the right side of the screen. And if you sign up before tomorrow's game between the Los Angeles Rams and New Orleans Saints, you can take advantage of 0.5 total yards for Matthew Stafford. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, let's talk about our wide receiver rankings, beginning with our number one, Tyreek Hill. Whenever Tyreek Hill is healthy, we already know that he's an automatic start. The only thing that I wanted to mention is the fact that this week they take on the Dallas Cowboys. Hopefully at home they can put up another great performance, and potentially this is going to be a shootout. Tyreek Hill right now needs to average 141 receiving yards in the next 3 games in order to surpass and break Calvin Johnson's receiving yard record of 1,964 yards. So hopefully Tyreek Hill is poised to have himself a big performance, especially considering he missed last week. Hopefully he can carry our teams to the next level and, of course, break Calvin Johnson's record. They're going to have the same amount of games. They'll both have played 16, considering Tyreek Hill missed last week. So there really won't be a conversation as to whether or not Tyreek Hill is one of the best wide receivers to play the game all time. On number 2 is CeeDee Lamb. CeeDee Lamb continues to score himself touchdowns. Thus far this season, he leads all players in terms of red zone targets, and he's number 3 amongst all players in terms of red zone touchdowns. Over the course of the last 9 games, he has scored 9 touchdowns, 7 through the air and 2 on the ground. Of course, was able to bail himself out against the Buffalo Bills, despite the fact that he had 7 catches for 53. He also had himself a 3-yard rushing touchdown that ended up getting him 15 plus fantasy points. Hopefully we can continue to see him put up great performances in a potential shootout against the Miami Dolphins that is expected. Number 3 for this week is Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel has been on fire. He has scored 7 touchdowns in just the last 3 games. Just to put it into perspective, Deebo Samuel has 15 receptions in the last 3 games. He has 5 receiving touchdowns throughout that span of time. 1 out of every 3 receptions he's hauling in is a receiving touchdown between weeks 13 through 15. As long as this momentum continues, taking on the Baltimore Ravens should be an exciting matchup. Of course, Deebo Samuel a must start as he continues to ball out and carry our teams. Moving on to the A tier, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown, who of course had a bounce-back performance of 7 catches, 112, and a receiving touchdown. Now going into this week's matchup against the Minnesota Vikings, we are hoping that the advantageous nature of the matchup itself, in terms of the Minnesota Vikings struggling to cover slot wide receivers, is going to, of course, shine down on Amon-Ra St. Brown for a great performance. Thus far this season, the Minnesota Vikings have allowed the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers. Not only that, over the course of this entire season, their primary slot corner, their nickel cornerbacks, whether it's been Byron Murphy, Cameron Bynum, or John Metellus, either of those three, they have all combined for giving up 97 receptions, 997 receiving yards, and 7 receiving touchdowns to opposing slot wide receivers this season. Amon-Ra, amongst all receivers in the slot this season, is number 2 in terms of receiving yards, only behind a guy like CeeDee Lamb. But either way, I'm expecting another big performance here out of Amon-Ra St. Brown. On number 5, speaking of this matchup against the Minnesota Vikings, we have Justin Jefferson. Immediately coming back from that injury in which he sustained the week prior with Josh Dobbs, and having a new quarterback and still being able to get himself 10 targets immediately with Nick Mullins is very promising. Going up against the Detroit Lions, who are the 6th best matchup at the position, they're allowing nearly 30 fantasy points per game since week 5 to opposing wide receivers in terms of just receiving statistics isolated. On top of that fact, we have a wide receiver like Justin Jefferson, who's one of the best in the National Football League, and he always balls out against the Detroit Lions. Over the course of the last 5 contests against the Detroit Lions, he has surpassed over 120 receiving yards 4 of those 5 games. The expectation, regardless of the quarterback play, is that Justin Jefferson should be able to put up a great performance here. Of course, Jordan Addison was the guy that scored the touchdowns last week for this offense. It could end up switching up this week and going in the direction of Justin Jefferson, considering how bad this secondary for the Detroit Lions has played as of late. On number 6 is Cooper Kupp, another one of these must automatic starts. They take on the New Orleans Saints on a short week, and typically I do worry about Thursday games because of that short week of going from a Sunday game to a Thursday game and potentially not being fully healthy. But the way that the Los Angeles Rams dominated against the Washington Commanders, were able to just sit back and relax. Cooper Kupp put up another great performance, 8 catches, 111 and a touchdown. That's 3 consecutive games in which Cooper Kupp has scored a receiving touchdown. The last time he was able to accomplish that was weeks 13 through 15 of the 2021 season. So just 2 seasons ago, he was able to accomplish that. We're getting back on track. Him, Matthew Stafford, Puka Nacua playing extremely well. The running game has been dominating with Kyren Williams. I think this is going to be a great matchup, especially considering Cooper Kupp is primarily playing in the slot. Thus far this season, Alontae Taylor, the primary nickel cornerback of the New Orleans Saints, has given up the most receptions, most receiving yards, and 3rd most receiving touchdowns to opposing slot receiving options. I'm expecting a huge game here from Cooper Kupp. Number 7 is Mike Evans, another one of these must-start players. In the 13 healthy games he has played this season, he's been able to score a touchdown in 10 of those 13 games. So, of course, we're expecting that Mike Evans will put up another performance in which he's able to find himself in the end zone and put up 13 to 18 potential fantasy points, taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jacksonville Jaguars are the 5th best matchup at the position, and even though they didn't give up much to Zay Flowers or Odell Beckham Jr. last week, we've seen many of wide receivers dominate against this defense. We're seeing Baker Mayfield coming off the best performance perhaps of his entire career, putting up a perfect passer rating, over 380 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns at Lambeau Field. That's the first quarterback to ever have a perfect passer rating at that field as a visitor. Pretty crazy, but either way, Mike Evans is assumed to potentially score a touchdown and have another breakout performance here. On number 8, another one of these must-start players is A.J. Brown. Even though A.J. Brown has struggled as of late, he has still gotten himself his fair share of opportunity. Each of the last 3 games, he's been able to get himself double-digit targets. What more can we ask for? They take on the New York Giants, who have struggled mightily. They're the 4th best matchup at the wide receiver position. And even though this secondary has played well at times this season, my expectation is that there are too many weapons at the disposal of Jalen Hurts taking on the New York Giants for them to not have a great offensive performance in comparison to where they have been over the course of the last 3 weeks, which is on a 3-game losing streak. This is a get-right game, and I expect A.J. Brown to, of course, have himself a solid performance here. On number 9 is Rashee Rice, the thumbnail of today's episode. Rashee Rice, man, I mentioned it last week. I wish I ranked him higher. And we have seen over the course of the last, 4 games here, weeks 12 through 14, since we have heard Andy Reid come out and say that he has become more Patrick Mahomes friendly, Rashee Rice has been averaging 16.35 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time. He's been able to go ahead and be the number 6 overall wide receiver in fantasy football between weeks 12 through 15 and dominating on a weekly basis. The expectation this week, taking on the Las Vegas Raiders, especially considering they took them on in week 12, in that performance, Rashee Rice, 10 targets, 8 catches, 107 and a touchdown, 20.7 fantasy points, is another big week here as Rashee Rice continues to put up great performances for fantasy purposes and is clearly the number 1 receiving option of this offense, even ahead of Travis Kelce. Number 10, we have DJ Moore, another one of these wide receivers that continues to have themselves great performances, even though he's coming off a lackluster week taking on the Cleveland Browns. That was pretty much expected. Like I talked about all last week, Denzel Ward was my biggest fear and that's exactly what was imposed upon DJ Moore. Now, going forward, taking on the Arizona Cardinals, quite literally the 7th best matchup at the position, we're talking about DJ Moore, who in the last 8 healthy games with Justin Fields, even when we don't count the 45-point game in which he put up against the Washington Commanders, is still averaging 16.44 fantasy points per game against opposing teams with Justin Fields as his quarterback. So my expectation is another big performance here from DJ Moore at home against the Arizona Cardinals. On number 11 is Stefon Diggs. Look, at this point, even though it is difficult to trust Stefon Diggs, considering the last 4 games with the new offensive coordinator have consisted of 8.75 targets, 4.5 receptions per game, 43.3 receiving yards per game, only 1 receiving touchdown in the last 4 contests, and he's only averaging 8.08 fantasy points per game. I understand the metrics are not on his side, but we have to hope that Stefon Diggs can put up a great performance similar to these other wide receivers that have taken on this defense. Most recently, of course, Davante Adams, 8 catches, 101 and a touchdown. Courtland Sutton, 3 catches, 62 and a touchdown. Zay Flowers, 5 catches, 25 and a touchdown. The Los Angeles Chargers, since week 5, have allowed the 3rd most receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers, 12 total in 10 games. The hope is that Stefon Diggs can get back on track and specifically find himself in the end zone. On number 12 is Brandon Aiyuk, who continues to play well. And even though he's coming off a performance in which he only had 3 catches for 37, you got to remember the streak of performances that he was putting together, the consistency of play that we had witnessed from Brandon Aiyuk. He was coming off of a 6-game streak in which he had 12 or more fantasy points. So I wouldn't worry about him. This week they do take on the Baltimore Ravens, and I understand there are other receiving options within this offense. Deebo Samuel, 7 touchdowns in just the last 3 games. Christian McCaffrey is obviously always going to be a touchdown machine. So is George Kittle. Even with that all being the case, Brandon Aiyuk is expected to potentially get himself back on track to this 12 to 15 point range, which he typically is putting up within this offense that, of course, can't be stopped by any defense. On number 13 is Michael Pittman Jr. Now, this is under the assumption that Michael Pittman Jr. is able to clear concussion protocol, is healthy and ready to go. Now, in Saturday's game against the Pittsburgh Steelers, with 8:50 left in the game, obviously got hit, and obviously the other guy got ejected, and Michael Pittman Jr. did not return for the remainder of that game. But throughout that span of time, in the first quarter and a half, he had accumulated 5 targets, 4 catches, 78 receiving yards. Okay, if you were to go ahead and kind of span that across the entire game, he was on pace for 13 targets, 10 catches, and over 200 yards within that given game. He was dominating early. You got to remember, in the 9 healthy games he has played with Gardner Minshew as a starting quarterback, in 8 of those games, he's been able to surpass 8 or more receptions. He is amongst the top in the league in terms of total receptions at the wide receiver position, half PPR, full PPR, and automatic start, assuming, of course, he's healthy. On number 14, barely fitting in there to close out the B tier, is Jayden Reed. Jayden Reed is another one of these players that we're not 100% certain whether or not he is healthy. He is dealing with a quote-unquote toe injury. So if this is turf toe and this is a minor condition, maybe he holds out for 1 week. Perhaps he plays this week. But if in fact it's like a grade 2 or grade 3 potential injury, from my experience, typically these players are going to miss 3 to 4 games. So hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully Jayden Reed is prepared to go out and put up a great performance and is healthy. Since week 10, in the last 6 games, he's averaging 13.57 fantasy points per game. He has surpassed over 13 fantasy points in 5 of the last 6 games, and he has scored 5 touchdowns in the last 6 games. With Christian Watson missing time, Jayden Reed continues to dominate down in the red zone, and as long as he's healthy, he's an automatic play going into the game week, taking on the Carolina Panthers. On number 15 is Chris Olave. Now, we heard earlier yesterday that there was a potential in which Chris Olave could play this week, Thursday Night Football. Now, obviously, he did not play on Sunday. But if, in fact, they fire him up to take on the Los Angeles Rams, a game in which, of course, the New Orleans Saints need to win. They're a 7-7 football team. They're trying to win their division or potentially vie for a wild card spot. Getting a victory over the Los Angeles Rams would be huge, especially as a tiebreaker. They're going to need the efforts of Chris Olave, who from weeks 1 through 14 has been averaging 11.7 fantasy points per game, 9 targets, 5.5 catches, 71 receiving yards, 0.31 touchdowns per game. And this week takes on the LA Rams. The LA Rams have been awful in terms of stopping opposing wide receiver ones. They're the 8th best matchup at the position. We have seen Curtis Samuel, 5 catches, 41, 2 touchdowns. McLaurin, 6 catches, 141, 1 touchdown. OBJ with 497 and 1. Flowers with 660 and 1. And Metcalf with 594 and 1. The LA Rams secondary has struggled. I would assume that if Chris Olave is playing this week and he's healthy, he's a fantastic play. On number 16 is Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper, after David Njoku is going to get his own utilization and is going to continue to do damage, then we move on to the potential of Amari Cooper having himself potential for upside. Now, obviously, he didn't find much success early in that game against the Chicago Bears, especially when Joe Flacco was throwing interceptions. But Amari Cooper late in that game came through and had himself a great overall performance. He's been able to get himself a total of 22 targets in just the last 2 games alone with Joe Flacco, and that is a huge difference maker in the potential upside going into this week's matchup against the Houston Texans. The Houston Texans against the opposing wide receiver ones. Garrett Wilson, 9 catches, 108. Courtland Sutton, 2 catches, 77 and a touchdown. Calvin Ridley, 5 catches, 89 and a touchdown. Jamar Chase, 5 catches, 124 and a touchdown. Amari Cooper is capable of doing so, and considering the fact that the Cleveland Browns are throwing the ball 44 plus times per game over the course of the last 3 games with Joe Flacco, Amari Cooper is a fantastic play. Our number 17 is Davante Adams. You cannot sit Davante Adams in any circumstance, and I think last week continues to prove that fact, considering in any given week, Davante Adams could have himself a monstrous performance, considering how elite of a wide receiver is. And now I understand the offense, the quarterback play, it's not at the top tier, but he's still able to put up, a solid performance. Now, in week 12, last time out against the Kansas City Chiefs, who he'll be taking on this week in Kansas City, he had 10 targets, 7 catches, 53, only 9.8 fantasy points. But he's been able to get himself 10 plus targets in 4 of the last 5 games. And there's always a realm of possibility in which Davante Adams can score himself a touchdown, even though last week's touchdown was thrown by Jacoby Myers on a trick play. Either way, they're going to give him opportunities. And when you give a player of this caliber enough opportunities, eventually he's going to find himself success, even against a tough secondary matchup with the Kansas City Chiefs. On number 18 is Jaylen Waddle. In the absence of Tyreek Hill, a monster performance. 8 catches, 142, and a touchdown, 24 fantasy points. Saved many of our teams in the first round of the fantasy football playoffs. Now, when given opportunity, he is an absolute monster for fantasy purposes. In the 8 games this season in which he's been given 8 or more targets, averaging 14.24 half PPR fantasy points per game. In the 5 games this season in which he's been given 6 or fewer targets, only averaging 8.6 fantasy points per game. Opportunity leads to success in fantasy football, and hopefully in an upcoming shootout against the Dallas Cowboys, he's going to continue to get himself a high volume of opportunity. Most recently, wide receivers against the Dallas Cowboys. Philadelphia wide receivers combined for 15 catches, 195. Seattle, 19 catches, 252 and 3 touchdowns. Washington wide receivers, 20 catches, 229. There is a lot of potential here, especially considering the secondary for the Dallas Cowboys have not played well as of late. And obviously they couldn't stop the run last week, so it'll only open up more play action for Tua and Jaylen Waddle. Our number 19 is Chris Godwin. Just a couple weeks back, the head coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the offensive coordinator both came out and said, we want to get Chris Godwin more involved. And since they have said that in the last 2 games, he has seen himself 11 and 12 targets. Opportunity leads to success in fantasy football. And Chris Godwin's coming off of his best game of the season, 10 catches for 155, 20.5 fantasy points. Takes on the Jacksonville Jaguars this week. The 5th best matchup at the position, with Baker Mayfield playing on fire and, of course, getting more comfortable with sending the ball in the direction of Chris Godwin. It's only leading to more fantasy points and allowing Chris Godwin to get back to this must-start wide receiver position. Moving on to our number 20, we have DK Metcalf. DK Metcalf's continuing the ball out, even in the absence of Geno Smith. In the last 2 games, without Geno Smith and with Drew Lock as the starting quarterback, 12.2 and 10.3 fantasy points. We'll take that. All things considered, we will take that. And obviously was able to put together some late game heroics against the Philadelphia Eagles to advance his team to a victorious position. But going into this week against the Tennessee Titans, this should be a game in which the Seattle Seahawks should show up and dominate across the board. This is the 11th best matchup at the wide receiver position. Most recently, wide receivers against this team: Noah Brown, 8 catches, 81 and a touchdown. Michael Pittman Jr., 11 catches, 105 and a touchdown. In the same game, Alec Pierce, 3 catches, 100 and a touchdown. Calvin Ridley, 7 for 103 and 2 touchdowns. Mike Evans, 6 for 143 and a touchdown. The Tennessee Titans cannot stop the deep ball. And of course, we know that Geno Smith and DK Metcalf are a perfect combo in that overall circumstance. Geno Smith ended up practicing on Wednesday, which gives us a lot of hope for the potential of DK Metcalf in the given week. Number 21, we have DeVonta Smith. They take on the New York Giants. In the last 3 games in which DeVonta Smith has taken on the New York Giants, going back to the 2022 regular season and postseason, he's put up 14.9, 15.1, and 10.2 fantasy points. Double-digit fantasy points in each of those 3 games. So even though DeVonta Smith has been a lesser version of himself since we have seen the return of Dallas Goedert to this lineup, I do expect to see DeVonta Smith be far more featured within the offense this week, especially considering the offense as a whole has struggled over the course of the last 3 games. Hopefully they'll continue to feature DeVonta Smith at an even greater role with more targets, leading to more, of course, fantasy points in our direction. Moving on to our number 22, we have Garrett Wilson. I understand that last week's game was an absolute disaster. 3 catches, 29 yards. A little bit of the game with Zach Wilson, a little bit of it with, of course, Trevor Siemian. But Trevor Siemian did nothing in the absence of Zach Wilson. From what we have witnessed this season, from weeks 1 through 14, with Zach Wilson starting as the quarterback from the beginning to the end of a game, he has allowed Garrett Wilson to average 10.9 targets, 6.4 receptions, 75 receiving yards per game, 0.2 receiving touchdowns per game, and 11.8 fantasy points per game. He continues to dominate, and this week, they take on the easiest matchup at the position, the Washington Commanders, who are allowing nearly 36 fantasy points per game. Recently, the LA Rams wide receivers, 15 for 205 and 2 touchdowns. Miami, 12 for 225, 2 touchdowns. Dallas, 13 for 245 and 3 touchdowns. Why not Garrett Wilson this week? Number 23, we have Puka Nacua. Now, here's the thing about Puka Nacua. Over the course of the last 3 games, now that Cooper Kupp is getting back to his normal self and scoring touchdowns every single game, getting the vast majority of overall targets within this offense, we have seen that Puka Nacua has taken a little bit of a backseat. Now, this week taking on the New Orleans Saints secondary, again, it's not the easiest matchup. They've only allowed 4 receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers in the last 10 games, which obviously is not a great matchup in that overall circumstance. There is a potential which Marshall Lattimore could play. He is on the injured reserve. They would have to activate him prior to this game. I'm assuming that they will not activate him, which will only make it easier for Puka Nacua to have himself a solid performance this week. It's just a matter of, is Demarcus Robinson going to continue to dig into the work of Puka Nacua? I would expect that to be the case. So as long as Demarcus Robinson's there, Cooper Kupp continues to dominate. Kyren Williams is one of the best backs in the league. Puka Nacua is a little bit of a lesser potential play within the given week. On number 24 is Zay Flowers. He's coming off a performance in which he had the second lowest targets of his entire career. Only 2 targets in a game against a top 5 matchup. You would have expected them to, of course, pass the ball far more, but there was a concerted effort to run the ball with Keaton Mitchell, Lamar Jackson, and of course Gus Edwards. And they dominated on the ground, and they really didn't have to get much utilization out of Zay Flowers or Odell Beckham Jr., who each had only 1 reception in that game. Now, going into this week's matchup against the San Francisco 49ers, a defense that, of course, has played well at times in terms of stopping the run, but as of late are dealing with a couple injuries, we may get into a position once again in which, of course, unfortunately, the Baltimore Ravens may not be passing the ball. If that's going to take place, of course, it's definitely going to hurt the potential of Zay Flowers. But in 3 of the 4 games in which Zay Flowers has played this season, without Mark Andrews in the lineup, he's got himself 10, 8, and 10 targets. That volume of opportunity is all we can ask for in a potential game that may be the preview to the Super Bowl. We're hoping for a shootout. Moving on to 125, we have Keenan Allen. I am hoping that Keenan Allen can play, but even if he does, we got to remember that this is an offense that is going to be playing against the Buffalo Bills. They're going to be in a negative game script, which could help Keenan Allen. And Easton Stick is not that bad of a quarterback. He can absolutely make Keenan Allen a relevant play. It's just a matter of, is he going to play? Time will tell. When you go back a couple weeks, in the game in which Justin Herbert left the game due to the injury, Easton Stick came in with 2 minutes left in the second quarter. With the remaining time in that game, he sent the ball in the direction of Keenan Allen 9 times for 6 receptions, 68 receiving yards, 9.8 fantasy points. It was a 38% target share. If he's going to continue to utilize Keenan Allen at that capacity, of course, expect him to be a must-start play within the given week. But considering we are not 100% certain as to whether he's going to play, time will tell. Moving on to 126, we have T. Higgins. T. Higgins, if you go back to 2022, weeks 8 through 12, there was a 4-game span in which Jamar Chase went to the injured reserve. Throughout that span of time, in the absence of Jamar Chase, we saw T. Higgins averaging 9 targets, 6.5 receptions, got himself 93 receiving yards per game, and a half a touchdown per game. 15.53 fantasy points per game. Now, of course, that was with Joe Burrow instead of Jake Browning. But Jake Browning has played relatively well as of late. So there's a potential in which, of course, T. Higgins could put up a solid performance. He's had over 60 receiving yards in each of the last 2 games. He's going to be the priority number 1 receiver, but he's also going to pull majority of the double coverage. We just have to hope that T. Higgins' talents can go ahead and dominate even in double coverage against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Moving on to our number 27, we have Calvin Ridley. I'm not 100% certain whether or not Trevor Lawrence is going to play. But let's say, for example, he does. We have seen Calvin Ridley in back-to-back weeks garner himself 12-plus targets in each game. Not only that, he had a touchdown that was called back last week, which in my opinion should have been a touchdown. Should have, wrapped up a perfect overall experience within that game. But obviously the booth review called it back. It is unfortunate, but this week they take on the Buccaneers, the 3rd best matchup at the position. We have seen Drake London, 10 catches for 172. Michael Pittman Jr., 10 catches for 107. Aiyuk, 5 catches for 156 and a touchdown. We had Wicks, 6 catches for 97, and Jayden Reed, 6 catches for 52 and a touchdown. Wide receivers dominate against Tampa Bay. Hopefully, Trevor Lawrence is healthy and ready to go after concussion protocol. Moving on to our number 28, we have Diontae Johnson. In the absence of both Kenny Pickett and now Mitchell Trubisky, we have Mason Rudolph as the starting quarterback of this team. In the last 2 games in which Diontae Johnson has played with Mason Rudolph as a starting quarterback, 13 targets, 7 catches, 83. And in the other game, 4 targets, 3 catches, 96. Pretty solid performances in terms of overall yardage. They take on the Cincinnati Bengals, who have given up great performances to opposing wide receivers as of late. Even though last time out, with Kenny Pickett as a starting quarterback, Diontae Johnson only got himself 4 catches for 50 against the Cincinnati Bengals in Week 12. We've seen Jordan Addison 6 for 111, 2 touchdowns. Justin Jefferson 7 for 84. Michael Pittman Jr. 8 for 95. OBJ 4 for 116. Diontae Johnson primed for a big performance here. On number 29 is DeAndre Hopkins. If in fact Will Levis is going to be out with the high ankle sprain, Ryan Tannehill would be the pivoting option. and I do not like that idea. I currently have DeAndre Hopkins ranked as low as he currently is because of the association with Ryan Tannehill. Ryan Tannehill, in the first 5 games of the season in which he was a starter, he only targeted DeAndre Hopkins 18% of the time, only an 18% target share, averaging only 9.72 fantasy points per game and only 8.4 targets per game. Obviously not great numbers, but honestly, let's hope that Ryan Tannehill can show up and show out against the Seattle Seahawks, whose secondary has struggled mightily as of late. It's just a matter of, can DeAndre Hopkins get enough targets to be fantasy relevant? Moving on to our number 30, we have Terry McLaurin. Look at the route tree that Terry McLaurin had. Obviously, as soon as they brought in Jacoby Brissett, there was a complete difference to this offense. Jacoby Brissett was immediately able to put the ball on Terry McLaurin. He scored an easy touchdown, could have easily had 2 touchdowns. Unfortunately, was called down at the 1-yard line. Nonetheless, they take on the Jets. The Jets defense are the toughest matchup, but most recently, we've seen Waddle, 2 different performances of over 100 yards against them as of late. Tyreek Hill over 100 yards. Khalil Shakir over 100 yards. We've even seen A.J. Brown, Keenan Allen, and Davante Adams all go over 76 plus receiving yards against this defense as of late. So it's not out of the realm of possibility, regardless of who's playing at quarterback, for Terry McLaurin to have himself a solid performance. 31 is Nico Collins. Now, this is under the assumption that, of course, he is healthy. And CJ Stroud is already assumed to potentially be out. So if we're in that overall kind of train of thought and they're taking on Cleveland, I don't really trust Nico Collins, especially considering the reason why I was so worried about DJ Moore last week was Denzel Ward. So I'm going to keep that same energy this week with the idea of Nico Collins getting number 1 coverage from Denzel Ward. Thus far this season, in the games in which Denzel Ward has been active, this defense is only allowing 144 passing yards per game. In comparison to when Denzel Ward is inactive, they're allowing 213 passing yards per game. A huge difference there, even though Case Keenum proved that he could still be a solid quarterback for fantasy purposes. Again, it's very sketchy overall play. Our number 32 is Courtland Sutton. Courtland Sutton, the only reason he's in this conversation is because he has scored 10 touchdowns in the last 14 games he has played. The New England Patriots are the 9th best matchup at the position, but the reason why I've moved Courtland Sutton as low as he currently is, even though he's certainly capable of putting up 13 to 15 points in any given week in which he scores a touchdown, is because there is a high expectation for this game to be a snow game. If that's going to be the case, there may not be as much of an emphasis on Courtland Sutton getting himself enough targets within the game because the weather concerns could end up being the biggest problem. Moving on to our number 33, we have Jordan Addison. I haven't had Jordan Addison in my rankings in a top 36 capacity in so long, but last week, hey, he showed up and he showed out. Put up a great performance, and now he takes on the Detroit Lions, the 6th best matchup at the position, nearly allowing 30 fantasy points per game. Coming off a week in which he had quite literally 2 receiving touchdowns, and the Vegas expectation in terms of total points scored between the Detroit Lions and Minnesota Vikings is the 2nd highest implication amongst all games this overall weekend. So with that information, we should expect a shootout between these 2 teams, and hopefully Jordan Addison getting another big performance here with Nick Mullins. On number 34 is Curtis Samuel. My voice is dying, but it is what it is. Curtis Samuel from weeks 12 through 15 in the last 3 games. He has gotten himself 14.5, 8.5, and 18.6 fantasy points. 26 targets in the last 3 games. He is amongst all players in the National Football League, number 20 amongst all of them in terms of red zone receiving touchdowns. And he's number 13 amongst all receiving options in terms of red zone receiving touchdowns inside the 10-yard line. They design plays for him. They get him open, and regardless of who's at quarterback, Howell or Brissett, should have himself a solid week against the New York Jets defense. On number 35 is Drake London. I don't know what to expect out of Taylor Heinicke. I would hope that he could elevate this offense. The one game this season in which Taylor Heinicke played as the full-time quarterback, Drake London missed that week due to a concussion. So if we're going to be in a situation in which, of course, Drake London is active this week, we can hope that he can have a pretty solid performance against the Colts defense, who we have seen number 1 wide receivers play well against. Diontae Johnson, 4 for 62 in a touchdown. D-Hop, 5 for 75 in a touchdown. Mike Evans, 6 for 70 and 2 touchdowns. Why not Drake London this week in week 16? On number 36 is Tyler Lockett. With Geno Smith practicing earlier today, that is very promising. The fact that they take on the Titans, the 11th best matchup, a defense that has given up 80 in a touchdown to Noah Brown, 105 in a touchdown to Michael Pittman Jr., 100 in a touchdown to Alec Pierce, 103 in 2 touchdowns to Calvin Ridley, 143 in a touchdown to Mike Evans. I would assume in the return of their starting quarterback, Tyler Lockett should have himself a solid overall performance. Noah Brown is our number 37. If in fact Denzel Ward is going to be the primary coverage on Nico Collins, it may allow for Case Keenum to continue to look in the direction of Noah Brown. 11 targets, 8 catches, 82 in a touchdown last week. We're hoping for a very similar performance. Like I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Nico Collins, CJ Stroud is not expected to play. Not only that, they take on the Cleveland Browns defense, who with Denzel Ward in the lineup are allowing just 144 passing yards per game, while when Denzel Ward is out of the lineup, only allowing 213. So a huge difference there. Denzel Ward is expected to play once again this week, which obviously makes it more difficult for these Texans wide receivers. On number 36 is Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Like I just mentioned just moments ago with Tyler Lockett, we are hoping that Geno Smith is going to be at a full capacity, no setbacks this week. They take on a pretty advantageous matchup, top 12 at the position, nearly allowing over 28 fantasy points per game. A defense that has given up a lot of receiving yards to opposing wide receivers. This Tennessee Titans defense as a whole on the ground through the air, they have struggled mightily. We know that Kenneth Walker didn't practice earlier today. That could end up potentially meaning a lot more passing within the given week. The final two options are Zay Jones and Adam Thielen. I'm going to go ahead and bundle them up because I'm losing my voice. We begin with Zay Jones. We are hoping that Trevor Lawrence is healthy, and so is Zay Jones. Without that, the contingency is dead. But the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are the third best matchup. They have allowed all the stats to all the wide receivers they have played. So if Zay Jones is available, and so is Trevor Lawrence, he's a play at a top 40 capacity. Adam Thielen's the last player I wanted to mention. This Packers defense has struggled mightily, and they most recently got killed by Chris Godwin and Baker Mayfield. If we can see a solid performance here out of Adam Thielen, it would not surprise me, considering the struggles of the coverage of the Green Bay Packers as of late. All right, guys, that's going to cover it in terms of my top 40 wide receiver rankings. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I appreciate all the support. If you guys have not yet already, click the like button, subscribe if you have not yet already. I'll be back tomorrow with quarterback and tight end rankings. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.